for the rim. Got it! Oh, the slam! Oh, using Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry!
On April 22nd, 1987, Miami was awarded one of two expansion teams along with Charlotte, meaning they would have to acquire players to an expansion draft. The other franchises were able to protect 8 of their guys, with anyone else being up for grabs. It still didn't leave a crazy amount of talent available, so once the draft concluded, a newly minted Miami Heat franchise was left with a good amount of names I'm fairly sure you've never heard of. Given the circumstances, 1989 brought only 15 wins, while the roster was mostly mirrored in obscurity over the next few seasons. As a matter of fact, nothing of too much significance happened until 1996, where after only 2 postseason appearances, they made their first and still arguably biggest splash in franchise history through acquiring Pat Riley. I mean, you could also argue having hired video coordinator Eric Spoelstra 1 year earlier was also pretty significant. That's just a topic for much later. The Godfather, who'd basically already been enshrined into basketball history for his work with the Lakers dynasty, was hitting turbulence coaching a New York team who'd just been flat out unable to get over the hump, even in the short absence of Jordan. When he caught wind of a team down south soon to be offering a job, Riley negotiated a rather hefty deal to become both president and coach of the Miami Heat. By the end of this video, I don't think you'll find it absurd to say this was one of the most consequential moves in NBA history. Upon his arrival, he wasted no time kickstarting a competitive roster, snatching all-star big man Alonzo Mourning from the Hornets, who was unhappy with their contract offers, and later on in the 96 season trading for Tim Hardaway. The shifty PG, known for his handles and flashy play during the Run TMC days, had become disgruntled in the Bay, with very obvious signs it was time to move on. He actually got Mourning to persuade Riley trading for him would be fruitful, offering he was the perfect guard to take Miami over the top. In February, a massive deal went down, turning dream into reality. Just 1 season into Pat's tenure, he'd given a recent expansion roster that hadn't made much noise an exciting duo which could conceivably become championship worthy sooner than later. Then, a decent stretch of what I guess I'd call misfortune. Having gotten everything together in 96, a deep run wasn't ever too realistic anyways, and drawing the 72-10 Wolves in the first round certainly didn't help matters. Despite becoming a 61-win second seed the very next year, they still ran 8 wins behind the defending champs, pushing forward to be gentlemen swept by them in round 3, but not before the famous brawl in the semifinals against New York, which ended up going 7 games. Speaking of, it's a good time to mention, Knicks v Heat was routinely so gritty, you've likely got the images mixed up in your head. New York was up 3-1 when Charlie Ward and PJ Brown got into a nasty tangle, ultimately leading to multiple suspensions. By Game 7, both Larry Johnson and John Starks were still banned, helping Miami pull off the rare feat. However, the suspension will prove to be an important caveat in a moment. For 98, the series would once again go the distance during round 1, which at the time could only go 5 games. In Game 5, not only would Larry Johnson once again be stricken from a deciding match, his former teammate Mourning would join him after the two scuffled, resulting in a famous picture where Jeff Van Gundy can be seen holding onto his leg for dear life. If I hadn't mentioned earlier, a big reason Charlotte couldn't afford Zoe was due to what they paid Larry. It was not a breakup decorated with flowers and roses. Both stars missing in action, the Knicks would happily take revenge, later on setting up a weird chapter in the upcoming lockout campaign. 1999 would bring massive opportunity for all contenders as MJ released his death grip on the league for a second time. It was so enticing, Miami hung a picture of a ring to make their intentions crystal clear. Truthfully, there was a great chance they'd at least reach the finals. Zoe posted a dominant season, finishing second in MVP voting and nabbed Defensive Player of the Year. Although it'd been a 3-way tie, the Heat claimed first seed along a Shaqless Magic squad and Indiana. As for New York, a season derailed by injury and a mad rush to incorporate new faces led to them just barely sneaking into the postseason as an 8th seed. Yep, a 3rd straight year of Knicks Heat would ensue. Only, being an 8th seed did the roster no justice. 1999 was a strange year for everyone, and New York actually began to figure it out toward the conclusion. It all culminated in another series that went the distance, this time with no suspension to alter the outcome. In a year where Miami should have gotten in the ballpark of a title at minimum, Allen Houston would dash their hopes through a brutal dagger, making it the 2nd time in history an 8th seed would knock off the 1st. This being the start to their finals run added insult to injury. Hardaway, who'd once told Zoe he was the point guard to take them all the way, had played a disastrous series. Even a slight bump in his play could have put them over the top. When the millennium turned, nothing changed when Miami again fell after 7 games while Mourning had repeated as depoy. By this point, Hardaway was flat out washing up a bit, while New York had done well in replacing Starks and Oakley with younger legs. So for 5 straight seasons, Miami's inaugural duo would either lose to Chicago or New York, both of whom were the only East teams to reach the finals from 96 to 99. For all you've probably heard in your life about the rivalry, they went 1-3 against the Knicks in this era, only winning a series which was likely over before the fight caused suspensions. Surprisingly though, far worse fates lay ahead for the young franchise. During the Summer Olympics in 2000, a 29-year-old Mourning began noticing swelling in his body and a general lack of energy. What was originally thought to be flight symptoms turned out to be a kidney disease, a rare one at that. The condition could eventually require a transplant, so as you can probably tell, it was a harrowing situation for both him and the team he had on his back. Given the situation, 5-time All-Star, 2-time Deep Boy, franchise-altering center Alonzo Mourning would suddenly have to miss an entire season, smack dab in the middle of an era where they were never too far away from greatness, also during his prime. Miraculously, he would reach a point where doctors cleared him to return late in the year, allowing participation in the final 13 games. Even so, there was no chance of a run. Zoe randomly thrust himself back into ball while Hardaway gradually turned into stone, begging the question, where was it all headed for Miami's first true competitive core? The clock was viciously ticking. While Hardaway had remained useful enough as a scorer to help his squad win 50 games in Mourning's absence, a first-round exit would put an official end to the tandem. In August of the offseason, Tim was shipped to Dallas for a second-round pick. While Zoe managed 75 games in 2002, there was no real direction or intention with said roster, leading to a lowly 36-win outing featuring their first playoff miss since Pat brought him on board all those years ago. So, the official end of an era. Mind you, the kidney issue had totally derailed an impressive star career to this point. The changes were abrupt and unexpected. However, him being advised to miss another season was always in the cards. They never quite knew if he'd stay in remission, get worse. The situation was truly day to day. He was, however, getting worse, and health needed to be prioritized with no guarantee he'd ever play again on top of being held out for the short term. Thus, 2003 became the lost season, as Miami was once again stuck in obscurity, hoping for the next big thing to chart a new path forward. Luckily, 2003 quite literally could not have been a better time to be restarting. The 25-win tank job ensured good positioning in a draft featuring phenom LeBron James, Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, Dwyane Wade, and Darko Milicic. With Miami picking 5th, they'd more or less be at the mercy of teams selecting beforehand, which was okay given the odds of landing a top-end successful talent, yet slightly disappointing given the original projection of them picking 4th overall. In hindsight, slipping one spot could have been catastrophic if not for Detroit's history-altering decision. Still, maybe that wouldn't have been enough. Only having now to choose between Bosh, Wade, or Melo, Riley later revealed he wasn't all the way sold on Wade because he felt he needed a point guard or a center, while also preferring to coach older players. Crazily enough, if Wade weren't available, they allegedly would have traded the pick to Orlando. Boy, did Pat avert a crisis. With the 5th overall pick in the 2003 NBA draft, the Miami Heat selected Dwyane Wade of Marquette. Maybe he wasn't 100% who they wanted, just absolutely who they needed. Plus, they'd get their crack at the other guys much later down the road. Fortunately, or just as a result of the mastermind himself, Miami's inaugural Wade roster wasn't half bad. Amore Odom left the Clippers via restricted free agency when they declined to match the $65 million offer. Eddie Jones was left over from a 2000 trade when Riley thought he could still build a contender around Mourning. Ron Butler had been chosen in the lottery a year prior, while Ray Froston had been signed the same week as Odom. Easy to miss, this is the same summer they acquired the services of undrafted forward Udonis Haslem, who'd start a long journey in his hometown alongside Wade. All things considered, going from a complete clunker dismantled by fate to the 04 roster was impeccable work by the Godfather, who so far had mostly lived up to every penny he demanded. Sadly though, he'd been unable to work out a deal to bring his original franchise cornerstone back, who'd agreed to a deal with New Jersey. How cool it would have been to see him and Wade play together. For now, the torch had silently been passed. On a coaching level as well, Pat allowed his assistant Stan Van Gundy to take over the new era while he'd remain team president. Despite a terrible start, by the end they'd managed their way back into the playoffs at barely over 500, with Wade having finished 3rd in Rookie of the Year voting. The future was clearly bright. In his first playoff game, the budding star fearlessly dropped in a game winner, shortly before improving even further to shine in the second round against the contending Indiana Pacers. Although they'd lose in 6, which could still be considered overachieving, there was no question he'd pushed the timeline up quite a bit. Wade was one of those special, rare talents capable of improving at maniacal pace. Meanwhile, the East wasn't that strong a conference. Reggie Miller's time was about up, as Detroit would become the team to beat. New Jersey already had 2 failed title runs under its belt, with the morning signing having yielded no help at all. Dwyane Wade having given a quick glimpse of what was possible, one more splash akin to what Riley done in the 90s could seal the deal. On July 14, 2004, according to Pat still to this day, the biggest acquisition in Miami Heat history had taken place, somewhat reluctantly. He hadn't necessarily wanted to break up what was a nice young core that clearly had potential. However, Shaq and Kobe's dealings were clearly over, and somebody was going to be the beneficiary. According to an article in June of 2004, as many as 20 teams had called to inquire about the services of O'Neal, although the number of realistic spots was much lower in reality. Butler alleges he found out about the trade in an airport while returning from a team vacation, initially believing he was now a part of a championship unit, only later to find out he was a key part of the deal. Cold world, bundle up. In any case, there was no doubt Riley had taken the appropriate risk. Believing Shaq had roughly 3 good seasons left, he pressed go, giving Superman his 3rd star guard to compete for titles with, and immediately giving his younger star a shot at contending. An event so significant, the celebration upon Shaq's arrival looked like an early title parade, where he did in fact guarantee a championship would grace South Beach under his reign. The Godfather had delivered in no time yet again. The franchise was only 2 seasons removed from having employed his last star, and were now plausible favorites in the East. Extremely early on, the malice at the Palace all but assured the contending Indiana Pacers would be handicapped moving forward, narrowing serious Eastern squads down to Miami and Detroit. The freshly minted duo were an immediate hit on the court, balancing each other out as many big man guard duos had preceding them. It really clicked once O'Neal bestowed a nickname amongst his running mate. After seeing Wade take off with the ball at lightning speed one play, he likened him to Flash. The rest is history. Through the successful first season, there were good feelings all around, eventually facilitating a return of Alonzo Mourning in March. He'd had a very unsuccessful couple of years after leaving in free agency, eventually being forced into the kidney transplant in December of 2003. Once New Jersey traded him to Toronto and he'd been waived, Pat did the only right thing by bringing him home. Miami achieved nearly 60 victories in their first run, Shaq finishing 2nd in MVP voting while Wade secured All-Star appearance number 1. Finishing 5 games ahead of Detroit, their shot at a championship was looking even more realistic than when they'd hung the ring picture after Jordan called it quits. They made quick work of a revamped Nets team who'd added Vince Carter, next dashing through the Wizards led by Gilbert Arenas. Their first true test? Defending champions, featuring Ben Wallace, who not only just helped defeat Shaq in the previous finals, but was now on one of 2 Defensive Player of the Years. It was a nasty, gritty series, as any early 2000s Pistons match would be. Although Shaq's series averages don't look too far off from the numbers that nearly brought him a 2nd MVP, his drop-off during the games was doing just enough to give Detroit light. By Game 7, he'd scored 54 points during first quarters on 81% from the field. On this particular night, he was already 5 of 6. The remainder of the games, only 73 points on 48%. He was still the Diesel, a great big man, yet clearly not the overwhelming force he'd been in LA for years. Making matters worse, in Game 5, Dwyane Wade strained his rib muscle on a drive to the rim. Sure, they still finished and took a 3-2 lead, only they'd have to try and close out Game 6 on the road without their star guard, which simply had no real chance of happening. He'd make an appearance in Game 7, only able to contribute 20 points on 7 of 20 from the field. It stayed close all the way through, but the defending champs were headed back to the finals to protect their title. For now, luck just hadn't been on the Heat side. Had Miami advanced, would they have defeated the San Antonio Spurs? If you remember the 2005 finals, those guys really got into it, and it took everything in Detroit's will to push it 7 games. A hypothetical surely beyond the scope of this video, and regardless of if they could have or not, by now you surely realize Riley never passed on opportunities to improve. It's the main reason why the 06 roster looks vastly different. Over the offseason, Pat would pull off what remains to this day the biggest trade in NBA history. Multiple players were moved, and in return, they added Jason Williams, who remained a brilliant floor general, Antoine Walker, who could still score while remaining versatile, and James Posey in an attempt to bolster the shooting around Wade and O'Neal. 1 month later, a very past his prime Gary Payton joined the fray, still able to contribute. All in an instant, a squad 1 win away from its first finals appearance completely revamped its supporting cast, presumably shoring up any former deficiencies. This notion came into question through the first 20 or so games as the injury-riddled team stumbled, posting a measly 11-10 record. Of course, Shaq had only played 3 games due to an ankle sprain, so the struggles weren't unwarranted, yet it didn't stop another massive shakeup. On December 12, 2005, Pat Riley would return from the front office, right into his former protege Stan Van Gundy's coaching position. The way history remembers the event without fail is a championship team was struggling. Riley strong-armed it and took matters into his own hands. At the time, however, Van Gundy reiterated it was due to wanting more time with his family, a concern he'd apparently brought up to Riley during preseason. Actually, Riley himself implored him to stay, not wanting a coaching change so abruptly. Though, if a mid-season coaching change was necessary, who better to guide the ship than the legend himself? After the rough start and short notice swap, Miami finished 41-20 under his leadership, good enough for a 52-30 record, while still being a whole 12 wins behind the Detroit Pistons, who had gone absolutely nowhere. Ben Wallace repeating as depoy. However, beyond their largely forgotten 64-win record, there were some cracks in the armor the Heat would eventually take advantage of. I would go as far as to say their roster was built perfectly to overtake them when they did. It is inherently important to mention how good this 06 unit was. Dwyane Wade had become a top player in the NBA, missing out on All-NBA first team mostly due to the level of talent in the league. Both Antoine Walker and Alonzo Mourning blipped on the 6th Man of the Year race, Zoe being 35 years old and, as you'll see later, somehow a prominent piece of their title. Deep, motivated, possessing 2 of the league's best players. What were they missing? Well, maybe experience from their young leader, which would be aided by a glossed over event during the Bulls series where Chicago was somehow in the middle of pushing the championship hopeful 6 games in round 1. Very eerie foreshadowing, as you'll soon see. Wade made a bad pass, triggering him to go at Gary Payton in the timeout huddle, something the legend didn't appreciate coming from an unproven young superstar. Yet this willingness of Wade to challenge a guy of Payton's stature, his extreme competitive spirit, for the moment, it could have caused turmoil, especially if it weren't the stoic Pat Riley Payton chose to aim some criticism at during the event. As it turned out, they were the perfect mix of personality to get through it. Wade later apologized to Payton on the plane, and the event was handled masterfully through their comments to the media. It helped them grow, and eventually find their footing in a series against an inferior opponent. After the predictable triumph, New Jersey stood no chance of winning only 1 game, as Jason Kidd's Nets had simply missed their timing, while also having struck out on Shaq during the summer of 2004. Kidd absolutely should have taken the deal with San Antonio. Finally, the biggest challenge of all, once again in the 2-time defending Eastern Conference champs. As you've likely figured out, a roster who flirted with 70 wins is a mere footnote because they'd lose to Miami in 6. How? Despite the awesome record, depth was a glaring issue, and they'd now been to 4 straight conference finals, winning games like clockwork. We can all think of great teams who've suffered from success. This one in particular had to face a Dwyane Wade bordering on unstoppable, alongside a Shaq whose field goal percentage landed in the mid-60s. Speaking of which, Dwyane Wade's 27 points, 6 assists, 2 steals, and 2 blocks a game on 62% from the field can't be praised enough. Say what you will about free throws in 06, but the man had simply ascended, perfectly living up to his nickname christened a season ago. Combine it with some uncharacteristic stinkers from Detroit starters who already didn't really have any dependable backups. For the first time in franchise history, the Miami Heat were on their way to the NBA Finals, just 1 year after bringing the Diesel to South Beach. The 2006 Dallas series is amongst the most infamous in NBA history, prompting an almost automated rigged response anytime it comes up. To state there weren't some questionable calls would be disingenuous. However, I've already done a video years ago going foul by foul showing most of the contact Wade created came by way of Mavs defenders simply being unable to stay in front of one of the fastest players in NBA history. Flash, even. But okay, most people have had their minds made up on the matter for well over a decade. How about what Dallas didn't do? After winning both games 1 and 2 quite easily, I bet you don't remember the Mavericks being up in Miami by 12 points with 8 minutes to go in the 4th. If you can't do translations, they'd won 2 games by double digits and had a vice grip on the 3rd to begin wrapping up the series. Miami simply outplayed them to get back into that one. When it was said and done, the Heat had finished the final 8 minutes on a 27-13 run. This was the singular moment damn near responsible for the series not being a flat-out sweep. Not to mention Nowitzki missed the game-tying free throw and still ended up with a chance to send it to OT. Game 4 hadn't even been close, with Jerry Stackhouse hitting Shaq harder than he should have, rendering him suspended for a pivotal Game 5 in a tied series. Fighting through his absence, Dallas still forced OT, with a chance to pull ahead and get 2 closeout games on their home turf. Instead, Josh Howard somehow called their final timeout while Wade was at the line, forcing his team into a full court heave to win the game rather than another drawn up out of bounds attempt. Of course, in 2006, the finals format was 2-3-2, meaning Dallas had returned from Miami in a drought, a feature of old final series Jerry Stackhouse partly blames for the collapse. In reality, once Wade became unleashed, they had zero margin of error and they blew it. Part of the reason Dallas so handedly took the first two games relied on their harassment of Shaq. Avery Johnson's defensive game plan held him to 17 points in game 1, dwindling to 5 points on 5 shot attempts in game 2. At which point O'Neal told the rest of his team, but especially Wade, it was on them, remarking he could only be a role player now. It activated Wade's aggression to the tune of 42 points in game 3, 36 in game 4, and 43 in the decisive game 5. It was his team, it was his series. There wasn't a single defender on the floor or planet even who could stop it if they wanted. It all came down to game 6 on June 20th, a date Riley had circled for his guys when they were struggling earlier in the series. After 18 years of existence and only 10 years since Pat took over, the ring he envisioned in the 90s was officially up for grabs. In not so subtle storybook fashion, if you actually sit down and watch game 6, you'll notice Alonzo Mourning making a bigger impact than Shaq. His energy was high, he pitched in 5 blocks at an ancient age, and the minutes had proven to be invaluable behind a Diesel clearly running short on fuel. It was as if to say to the world, O'Neal was brought here to finish the job, just don't forget the first center to make the franchise relevant. It's honestly a great what if to imagine Miami's path had Alonzo landed elsewhere in the 90s or just stayed in Charlotte. In our timeline, here he was, putting a bow on a handicapped, yet legendary and inspiring Miami Heat career. Oh yeah, a ton of D Wade as well. 36 points on 21 free throw attempts that when you go back and watch, will objectively realize were duly called most of the time. You also can't gloss over Udonis Haslem knocking down jumper after jumper from the defensive attention being elsewhere. He probably became a meme in your era, though I guarantee there's a reason he's been revered in Miami the way he has for so long. Thus, after Dallas had one more chance to extend their lifeline at the end of regulation, the deed had been done. In his first NBA Finals appearance, D Wade had evoked Jordan's name by averaging 35 points, 8 rebounds, 3 steals, and a block a game, while also shooting nearly 100 free throws, only barely to be outdone by Elgin Baylor once upon a time. Shaq received another coveted title to place him one over Kobe, while Riley added another notch to his legend, having once again made good on a promise. You might have noticed an issue here though. Upon acquiring Shaq, the plan was around a 3-year window. This was year 2. Injuries had been plaguing him up to this point, causing a sharp drop in production on a championship team. Along with the other guys whose best days were behind them, where was the roster headed next? Dwyane Wade had become the first star of his esteemed class to earn a title, yet alone even get close to one. Repeating is often a lofty task, but what better way to go about it than stability? For 2007, Miami employed much of the same roster wearing the 06 ring, while the Eastern Conference saw little to no significant change. Well, other than Ben Wallace spurning Detroit for the Bulls, that young startup we spoke of earlier who managed to take Miami 6 out of seemingly nowhere. No worries though, this roster was championship made now. It'd take nothing short of perfection to take them down. Or injuries. The one thing a relatively older roster absolutely could not afford after getting fat off of success was unnecessary hurdles, of which there'd be plenty. Starting on opening night, a first round rematch with Chicago resulted in an absolute drubbing to ruin the ring ceremony, 108-66. Also producing one of the greatest gifs to ever grace the internet, Wade would be the only member of his squad to score double digits while everyone else suffered a miserable night, a sign of the season in store. Miami would only beat them one time in 2007, hang on to that information. By the end of January, Shaq had only appeared in 3 total games due to a knee injury necessitating surgery, while Wade's troubles weren't far behind. In March, Flash would sustain a dislocated shoulder, costing him 23 games as the rest of the league was ramping up for postseason runs. Jason Williams and a bevy of other role players over 30 missed time, ultimately bringing their finishing record to 44-38, dropping from defending conference champions to 5th seed for the playoffs. The neat part was, each squad still were relatively weak. Regardless of record, Chicago was not a championship team, LeBron James had no actual co-star next to him, Toronto wasn't contending, and Detroit, as mentioned earlier, were hanging on to threads of contention without their defensive centerpiece. Yes, this is the conference Tony Parker was talking about when admitting they knew they'd be champions as long as they beat Phoenix. All to say, if Miami could put together health at the right time and peak, a run through a conference they'd already scaled wasn't necessarily out of the question. A run was totally out of the question. Upon returning in April, Wade finished with averages of 15 points, 5 turnovers, and 44% from the field. In even worse news, Superman was down to the first sub 20 point per game season average of his entire career. Overall, Miami dropped from 7th in offensive rating to 24th. Particularly bad timing considering they were now up against the league's best defense and, you guessed it, Chicago with Big Ben. Aside from the Bulls having their number all season long, the defense and Miami clearly limping into postseason play, Ben Gordon and Luol Deng absolutely torched the Heat ironically, outscoring both pieces of the former championship duo. In a series involving 2 blowouts, the Baby Bulls would become the first team since the Suns in 2000 to defeat a reigning champ in the first round. Even this feat was enabled by Tim Duncan's absence. However, they would be the first team to sweep a defending champion since the 50s. Unbelievable way for a Cinderella story to go out just 1 year later, and the worst part was you couldn't actually find a bright side. Remember the question of if the 2005 Heat would have gone on to win the title by defeating Detroit? Also, the initial reluctance of Pat Riley to trade all those young pieces for Shaq? The consequences had come to roost. Sure, 07 featured some bad luck, it didn't change the fact that most of the support designed to help a younger Wade was simply wilting. Not only had O'Neal been dealing with injuries over these seasons, he was now huge and in his mid-30s. Jason Williams, Antoine Walker, and James Posey, despite not even being really old, were past their individual primes, while Gary Payton and Alonzo Mourning were ancient, the glove packing it in for retirement after the sweep. Wade, of course, wasn't without issue himself. Directly after elimination, he opted for surgery on both his knee and shoulder, marking the first chinks in his armor. Heading into 2008, having lost key pieces to free agency, aging, and signing nobody significant, how would a wounded Warrior recapture the magic of 2 years ago? Wasn't it time to start planning the future of a competitive roster for their star shooting guard without tanking? Acquiring Penny Hardaway's corpse in place of Gary Payton did little to inspire confidence. Adding insult, Boston formed the Big Three this same summer, posing an immediate roadblock for all Eastern teams which hadn't existed in the East since the 90s. On top of Detroit still hanging around and making conference finals after Wallace's departure, Orlando growing up under Dwight Howard, and the Cavaliers fresh off of a finals appearance displaying the true greatness of LeBron James, what if he landed help at any point? By all measures, the Chosen One had just scaled this conference with one of the worst finals rosters ever. Change was imminent. The 2008 Heat got off to an 0-5 start, and there'd be zero momentum for a turnaround. Much of the roster spent time injured, including the stars. Zoe had a season-ending injury, ultimately sending him to retirement. There was very little trade interest in Shaq given his decline, all leading to an 8-28 record by January, more or less signaling the season was prematurely over. Unfamiliar tension and failure resulted in a blow-up during practice, where Riley tossed Jason Williams out for just barely being late. Shaq disagreed with the decision, causing a shouting match between the two, very much cementing the end of this run. Everything had broken down, their bodies, spirits, will, hope. This wasn't like the time Riley and Mourning got into a shouting match inspired out of motivation and improvement. They were done. In February 2008, Shaquille O'Neal was dealt to the Phoenix Suns, Rashawn Marion, and Marcus Banks. If the haul doesn't sound like a haul, it's because it wasn't. In summer 04, Riley's prediction of a 3-year window had been absolutely correct. By the conclusion, this is what he was worth. Miami was now worth a high draft pick at least. Shortly after the trade, Wade opted to sit the remainder of the season to treat his surgically repaired knee from the previous summer, where doctors had told him it'd take a full year to feel right again anyway. Sitting on 11 wins, he saw no reason to continue, while Riley agreed, saying, quote, "Yes, we aren't going to make the playoffs. It's a lost season. We know that. We don't want it to be a lost career." That's how I look at it. Getting shockwave treatment here in March would also allow Wade to rehab and still possibly participate in the China Olympics, an integral part of where everything was headed next. So the way it's been romanticized shapes the story as if LeBron, Wade, and Bosh planned some super secret initiative during their time together in summer 2008. And while being teammates here certainly helped matters, it actually dates back even earlier to when the trio signed 3-year rookie scale extensions, although they could have done like Melo and signed for 5. Or just each made their own decisions. According to Bosh, this was specifically for flexibility, which paid off as you see in the present day. Anthony is still doing media rounds trying to clear up why he was traded somewhere he apparently didn't ask to go while stuck in said contract, also retiring ringless. The three had also played together in Japan during 06, where they initially strengthened their bond in the presence of Miami Heat owner's son Nick Arison. A not so subtle detail. With their contract set to expire in summer 2010, here in 08, it was all beginning to line up perfectly. Bosch's Raptors had never been much more than a decent team. Cleveland was well into feeling the consequences of having fumbled Boozer and just generally not being able to persuade anyone to come there, while Miami's win now plot from 2005 was also deploying its repercussions. Would any of it change enough over just 2 years? In the meantime, they won gold together, with tidbits of the run serving as proof of concept. Coming off injury, Wade had no issue taking a lesser role and supporting from the bench. The idea behind this concession would serve them years later. For now, it was back to their home destinations where, for Wade, Miami had drafted Michael Beasley at pick number 2. This does serve as one of the greatest draft upsets in history, where Miami had 25% odds at landing the first pick, with the honor going to their recent enemy Chicago, who had only a 1.7% chance. In the short term, things would get scary. As you already know though, this is likely the greatest thing to happen for the franchise since drafting Wade. Along those lines, back in April, Riley had once again stepped down as coach, handing the team off to former video coordinator and now longtime assistant coach Erik Spoelstra, saying, quote, "This game is now about younger coaches who are technologically skilled, innovative, and bring fresh new ideas. That's what we feel we are getting with Erik Spoelstra. He's a man that was born to coach." I can't help but notice how many critical decisions Riley made along the way, being very much like ones Popovich made when we discussed the Spurs last month. But yes, the 2009 Miami Heat could have trotted out a lineup featuring Wade and Rose, or even Westbrook and Wade, which isn't discussed as much. You just then have to ask, what would have happened in 2010? Depending on Michael Beasley, more or less kept Miami average, as he absolutely was not the man for the job. In Draft Express's assessment, his weaknesses included attitude, focus, and off-court red flags. He got busy living up to the rep early when, in September, he along with Chalmers and Darrell Arthur violated rules at the NBA's official seminar designed specifically for rookie transitioning, resulting in a $50,000 fine. What he did wasn't exactly the biggest deal, it was just right in line with his profile and a sign of things to come. Beasley would go on to average 14 points a game, which wasn't a bad start. Meanwhile, Wade upped his average to 30, along with 8 assists and 5 rebounds while playing in 79 games to send a very clear message. He was still Flash. Of course, the lackluster roster proceeded to play one of the worst 7-game series ever against Atlanta, predictably bowing out in the first round, with Wade's patience already running short. In July of 2009, Pat Riley admitted Miami needed a long-term commitment from its star before they set off improving the roster, while Wade, who just finished both third in MVP voting and Depoy after having his health questioned, responded he'd need to see roster improvements before doing any such thing. He reiterated there was no rift, it was just the fact every other Eastern contender had gotten better while they were sitting ducks. A huge risk from Riley, by the way. Sure, he was going the way of New York, who were essentially saving money for 2010 free agency, but LeBron had just won MVP and now had a roster widely considered to be favorites in the East. If he completed his mission in Cleveland, it was likely the end of the big plot. A plot which gained even more credence early on in the season when Pat orchestrated a meeting between Jordan and James while they were both in town. It's very weird cause apparently you had a rival team's president taking another team's best player and very soon to be free agent to go talk with Jordan about how more players should pay homage to him? I mean, I guess. Riley did after all have Jordan's number hanging in the rafters after he led one of the only teams Miami couldn't beat in the 90s. And apparently the meeting sparked something, as after the game, James announced he would be putting 23 down, also imploring the rest of the league to retire it. If anything was clear, the Godfather's pool remained very much alive and well. This did little for Miami in the short term, who remained painfully average with zero hopes of making any noise. In August before the season, their second-year lottery pick had also broken the rules of the league's drug program, accompanied by a series of concerning tweets you can no longer find. This while also having a picture where you could see large amounts of weed and another picture of him passed out surrounded by bottles. In short, there were a lot of non-basketball factors ensuring Beasley wouldn't be around too long. Miami fell to Boston, who were on another title run rather quickly, leading to the moment of truth. 2 years had passed since the trio spent time at the Olympics, and the conditions couldn't have been more ripe for a seismic move. Kobe had just won his 5th, triggering Wade and James to have further conversations about making their dream reality. LeBron now sat on 2 MVPs, expected to have been the guy stopping Kobe from winning that 5th. Bosh just needed any type of success in general, while the Big Three Celtics were entering their 4th year of having disrupted the landscape through joining forces. With all 3 stars existing in the East and Boston only having failed 1 conference run so far due to injury, could you even justify a move if it didn't create a team as good as or better than them? Still, there were options. Amar'e Stoudemire could be on the move, possibly to South Beach, which would be massive. Chicago was trying to land at least 2 out of the Big Three. LeBron initially chatted with Bosh about coming to Cleveland. A lot of different scenarios out there exist, and none of them competed with Pat Riley. He brought his 7 rings, financial analyst showing how it all worked, Alonzo Mourning, who he treated like royalty even throughout his kidney issues, while also assuring James he'd make necessary accommodations for his friends. Something Chicago apparently wasn't willing to do, and given their history since Jordan, I wouldn't put that rumor past them. In reality, with Miami of all locations being the easiest place the trio could work, who was really even offering a challenge? Not to mention his great friend and already NBA champion Dwyane Wade was pushing hard. Having proven in the years since surgery, he remained a top talent. On July 7th, 2010, 5-time All-Star and top big man Chris Bosh agreed to join the Miami Heat. Now, regardless of James joining or not, Riley had already worked another miracle, adding to his lengthy track record in this league. At least for 2011, Wade, Bosh, and whatever LeBron's money could pay for would be enough to contend in the East, and for sure be players in title talks. While James could have gone elsewhere, teaming up with Rose in Chicago, or even forming his own duo with Stoudemire in New York, why do anything other than potentially become unbeatable with his friends? And so, that's exactly what he did. All in one fell swoop, the entire landscape of the league had changed forever. Revisionist history has hit the Heatles hard, so allow me to document here that the "yes we did" party was no exaggeration. Chris Bosh had been a top big man for years now, routinely ranking in the higher portions of top 5s when discussing power forwards. LeBron needs no introduction, and as you've seen up to this point, Wade's surgeries had done little to deter his on-court production. The boastful party shortly after LeBron's dramatic decision airing wasn't just some impulsive overreaction. Pat Riley had presumably pulled off an unthinkable feat in joining 3 guys this good, this young, all at once. Boston had traded for their trio, each star already having a decade or more under their belts. LeBron James told an ecstatic crowd they could win north of 7 championships not because he was joking, but because landing somewhere in that ballpark seemed more than plausible in the moment. Getting started, a very eerie sign appeared on day 1 when, during preseason, Dwyane Wade suffered a hamstring injury almost immediately, assuring we wouldn't see much of the unthinkable trio until a real record was at stake. Health-wise, all would be smooth sailing for the foreseeable future though. And what better way to kick off the era than addressing the elephant in the room right away? Miami would be sent to Boston on opening night, facing one of the very reasons they existed in the first place. The OG Big Three constantly blocked LeBron's path to greatness, most recently having snuffed Wade's scrub squad out with no second thoughts. Having retooled themselves, most believed their experience could keep them ahead of Miami for the moment, and on this night they were right. A loss in Game 1 would set a trend where the Super Friends stumbled mightily into a 9-8 record toward November's end, showing obvious signs of adjusting, as after all, here were 3 first options who'd known nothing other than hoisting teams on their backs for 7 years. Sure, the 08 Celtics hadn't faced such issues early on, they were also a much deeper and experienced team out the gates. The last straw came in a loss to Dallas, where LeBron could be seen shoulder bumping Eric Spoelstra on his way back to the timeout huddle in the midst of yet another loss. Apparently around this time, Spoelstra was already on the chopping block, Riley later revealing James suggested having him fired. Quote, "I remember LeBron looking at me and he said, 'Don't you ever get the itch?' I said, 'The itch for what?' He said, 'The itch to coach again.' I said, 'No, I don't have the itch.' Well, that was the end of that." Remember, he hadn't even wanted to step into Van Gundy's position contrary to popular belief. Here lay the first sign of one legend refusing to bow to the demands of another. Then, I remember it like it was yesterday. Out of nowhere, a struggling unit with mountain-high expectations ran off 12 straight victories effortlessly. It was the moment where we all went, oh yeah, they were supposed to be jaw-droppingly good. And here they were. Ironically, the streak would end at the hand of Dallas via a 2-point loss in Miami, where the Mavs completed a season sweep. An easy loss to ignore given they'd finally reached expectations. It was one of only 2 losses the Heat would suffer from November 29th to January 12th. Still, it became difficult to overlook they were simply falling short where it mattered. A sweep at the hands of Dallas, a sweep to Chicago, and only 1 win against Boston at the very end of the season. Even more concerning? a 5-game losing streak in March when they were supposed to be ramping up. Another point where Spo's job got called into question, this time by the media, with Riley once again immediately shutting the noise down. Despite all the drama and apparent struggle, the 2011 Heat finished 58-24, good enough for a second in the East. LeBron, however, hadn't won MVP due to this being somewhat of an underperformance, and there were high beliefs a third round of Celtics-Lakers was on the horizon. Miami sent Philly packing in 5, setting up a grudge match round 2 against Boston, who looked a bit different from opening night. After taking a 2-0 lead, Rondo inspired them to victory in Game 3 with one arm, while LeBron put together an underrated Game 4 performance responsible for his squad escaping the Garden with a 3-1 lead. By Game 5, a wounded Warrior would go down swinging, clearly about to undergo some changes. LeBron put together another massive run to add an exclamation point, with he and Wade hugging it out at the end knowing they'd just taken an enormous step. Next on the list were the Bulls, led by MVP Derrick Rose, who had home court advantage and won their 5th straight against Miami through a Game 1 victory, somehow marking the only one they'd win. LeBron went on to guard Rose, slow him down, and helped Miami to 4 straight victories, advancing to the NBA Finals in year 1 of the coalition. A magnificent feat given the kinks they'd worked out in just one season. Throughout the year, Wade and James scored almost evenly, while Bosh obviously took the biggest cut, being the only non-ball handler. Through these first playoff series, the trend remained mostly the same, with the exception of round 3 when Bosh overtook Wade in scoring. No matter the order, South Beach's stars had found their roles well enough to play winning basketball against contending teams, now taking it all up against the Dallas Mavericks, a 2006 Finals rematch with very different looking rosters. Most importantly, Dirk and Wade remained, with almost no real chance Dallas would be able to extract revenge. Game 1 appeared to be more of the same, with the trio flying up and down the court, absolutely blitzing a Mavericks team much more predicated on overall team basketball. Game 2 was rerunning the script, when all of a sudden, Miami's inexperience began to show. Having taken a 15-point lead with 7 minutes remaining, the series was merely a formality. Wade drained a 3, causing reality to set in. They were just too damn good. LeBron had been taking the back seat, Bosh was having an off night, meanwhile Wade was putting up 06 numbers, which had been all it took to eventually blow the lid off. The Mavs looked outclassed to begin with, and it's what was expected after all. The entire league was outclassed. As the duo began celebrating, however, they left way too much time on the clock. In what remains one of the greatest comebacks in finals history, Dallas took revenge for the one that got away back in Game 3 of 06, furiously swiping the lead and momentum away from a team who was already mentally popping champagne. After Dirk gracefully dropped in the go-ahead bucket, Wade very narrowly missed a Hail Mary attempt to set everything straight. Miami was never the same afterwards. Regardless of barely winning Game 3, LeBron James had effectively been eliminated from the series thanks to Dallas's defensive game plan, lowering his aggression and increasing his tendency to defer to his other first options. A clip aired where you could see Wade getting on his case, no doubt an unfamiliar feeling for either of them. In both Games 3 and 4, James had turned in only 17 and 8 points respectively, making it especially confusing when the two chose to mock Dirk Nowitzki's sickness before an all-time important Game 5. Yeah, they took an L there, and in Game 6 on their home floor to infamously flame out in a final series which no doubt would have awarded Dwyane Wade his second finals MVP. Therein lay one of the main issues. While the three had found an effective pecking order for 99% of the season, what about when adversity struck in do-or-die situations? The natural choice would be to look at whose team it was, Wade's at the time. In a move of pure humility during the summer, Flash would relinquish this title, telling LeBron he was the best player in the league and he needed to command total autonomy going forward. Establishing so ahead of time may have saved the trouble when push came to shove in Dallas. LeBron needed to be a better overall player as well. Dating back to the 07 finals, a lot of the times his team couldn't get over one more hump had to do with his game being technically limited, a downfall which remained true when Dallas employed a zone to take him out of rhythm. With all being right in the world because the Heat had failed, James took it upon himself to train with Hakeem and expand his game going forward in preparation for leading his best team yet. In light of his operations, Wade had played nearly 3 full seasons of basketball with no real issues. 2012 would bring a lockout, forcing a slightly sped up schedule where only the strongest could survive. After adding a couple support pieces, they blasted out of the gate immediately, seizing revenge on Dallas in an effort to set the tone for the season. It'd be a struggle from there, as the former beacon of health would miss 12 games by January's end, through an assortment of random nicks and dings. The struggles opened the door for James to take control of matters even more, leading to his third MVP, as his game clearly benefited from all adjustments made since the finals. He shot the highest 3-point and field goal percentage of his career, dominated both ends of the court, had been distinguished as the clear first option between he and Wade, and this is how it was always meant to be. Finishing second behind Chicago once again, who had spent much of the year without D. Rose, there remained little hope anyone could realistically dethrone them if healthy. Boston and Orlando had fallen well below their better days, while no other true contenders were thought to exist in the conference. Miami and New York rekindled their battle from the 90s, although this time the Heat were head and shoulders above their counterparts, handing down a gentleman's sweep. Round 2 would bring the first of many bouts against Indiana, who nobody could make much of. Here, it appeared there was a random, younger team trying to figure out their next steps and nothing more. When Bosh went down though, and Wade began to experience knee soreness, the Juggernaut once again found itself on the hot seat, down 2-1 to a team nobody had a clue was so capable. After Game 2, Wade had to have his knee drained, officially kicking off the start to his gradual decline that would later prove detrimental. This is where people have chosen to rewrite his career over the years though. He didn't just wash up and never return from here. In the final 3 games afterward, he scored 30, 28, and 41 points to help set the record straight, getting Miami back to the conference finals where they'd face Boston once again. Rose tore his ACL, so a stand-in was necessary. The first 4 games took place without Chris Bosh, leaving James and Wade to face a squad still containing its championship DNA, even if the physicals no longer matched. And as a lot of Heat veterans have mentioned recently in the media, Bosh may have not been Miami's best player, yet he was one of the most important. If James were to go down, Wade could do some ball handling duties. Bosh goes down, the roster had nothing even close to a replacement. So through a ridiculous 7-game series, matters almost went extremely sideways. Only James still had demons to conquer, and so he did in one of NBA history's greatest comebacks. It can't be understated how vital avoiding elimination here was. After all the years it'd taken this trio to materialize, the party, the 2011 meltdown, there had been discussions of who was getting traded and for what should they fail to emerge from the East. Pat Riley's biggest move to date would have gone up in flames, once again altering the landscape of the league. It was a fate too cruel to play out. Miami would reach the finals, coming face to face with the Thunder team who'd been on the horizon for some time now. This go around, there'd be no avoidable issues. LeBron's passiveness would never again see light of day. No premature celebrating and unfocused mannerisms. Having gone through more trials early on than anyone expected, Miami would triumph in 5, once again completing another Riley project. Their second title in franchise history, with many more to come. Right? Wade having officially taken a back seat as promised, he opted for another knee surgery in July. 10 years prior, back in 2002, shortly before his NBA career began, he had his meniscus removed, a decision directly causing the issues he'd been experiencing over his career. Another knee operation would bring the total to 3, as although he'd finally captured a second title, the amount of treatment it took to get him on the court throughout the run was deeply concerning. Admittedly, removing his meniscus proved to be the wrong choice for a lengthy career. All the winning simply blocked out any noise. Plus, there'd be plenty of it to go around in 2013, as without any pressures left, the Miami Heat coasted through one of the greatest regular seasons of all time, easily setting their franchise record with 66 wins. Behind it, an even further improved LeBron James, relatively healthy Wade, and the addition of Ray Allen, who'd spurned Boston after multiple years of tension and mistreatment. The unit literally lacked nothing now, other than maybe a traditional center, which was becoming increasingly less important. James laid down one of the best individual seasons ever, where he very much should have probably won Defensive Player of the Year on top of his MVP. Only now, over a decade later, is he shooting a better 3-point percentage than he did in 2013. It was truly incredible to watch. A 27-game win streak ensued, only ending at the hands of a Chicago team awaiting for the return of their former MVP. The record remains the second highest win streak of all time, behind only the 72 Lakers, who managed 33 straight. Riding ridiculous momentum into the playoffs, there was virtually no chance of losing in an East missing D Rose or a contending Celtics team. By most accounts, Knicks heat would once again rekindle, Carmelo Anthony having received the only MVP vote to block LeBron's win from rightfully being unanimous. Unfortunately, they were thwarted by a Pacers team who'd grown up a bit from 2012, anointing Paul George as its official new leader. Back to Miami missing a traditional big, 7'2" Roy Hibbert would also cause a matchup issue, helping Indiana push a juggernaut 7 games. Had it not been for the easiest game winner of LeBron's career, it isn't unthinkable to imagine the Pacers outright advancing to the finals. Paul George got his breakout, Indy was clearly legitimate in an Eastern Conference begging for fresh blood, but the Heatles were on a mission. Nothing short of a dynasty would suffice. For finals run number 2, they'd come up against an older dynasty who were now on year number 6 of trying to get back. Due to the struggles, San Antonio was likely a bit hungrier, resulting in a much tougher final series than the last two combined. It shouldn't be overlooked that by now, LeBron constantly having to go pedal to the metal was becoming more and more necessary in only year 3. Wade might have had an explosion here or there, yet the days of him averaging 25 beside LeBron seemed to be quickly fading. Then when you'd expect Bosh to fill in given his Toronto production, he receded further into third option territory. Truthfully, up to the NBA Finals, it hadn't been an impressive showing for the Big Three as a whole. Ray Allen was their second leading scorer versus Milwaukee. Wade averaged 12 against Chicago, while Mario Chalmers served as the tertiary scorer against Indy. For a team who'd set its sights on a dynasty never seen before, the overwhelming star power appeared questionable by year 3. On the contrary, it was a deep unit. Maybe it didn't matter who did the scoring so long as LeBron was clearly leading the charge. Through a brutal 7 games in which Miami once again had to re-emerge from the dead, they'd prevail after a history-altering moment akin to divine intervention. What should have easily resulted in a 1-2 finals record became the first repeat champion since Kobe and Shaq's Lakers. OKC and San Antonio, the absolute best the West had to offer, had now fallen in consecutive years. Sure, the playoff run as a whole seemed more than enough to question Miami's ability moving forward, however, a three-peat certainly remained attainable. Part of the reason Wade continued to seemingly shrink was, of course, his knees, suffering bone bruises, reportedly needing draining, and 8 hours of therapy before Game 7. We now know through these seasons, he was in so much pain, he considered retiring early. Quote, "My knees were in so much pain. In my right knee, I had 2 sets of different bone bruises. I also had chondromalacia under the kneecap, which irritates the kneecap to the extent where it's just more pain. In my left knee, I had 3 surgeries, so I'm dealing with arthritis. I'm dealing with swelling and all the stuff that comes with that. It was a time where I didn't want to do it anymore. I didn't want to be in pain anymore." The limping champion had done so much for South Beach. Arriving in 2003, by now he could be credited with more or less saving the franchise from doom after Alonzo Mourning's abrupt ending. You do have to wonder how much of these present struggles LeBron was watching while remaining silent though. He'd signed on to win as many championships as possible. With Wade's knees balloon-sized by the end of games, how many more could they squeeze out? In summer 2014, all 3 stars would need to make decisions about the future. Understanding his health concerns, Miami created a rest plan aiming to reserve his knees down the road. In accordance, at age 32, Wade appeared in only 54 games, his lowest total since the mid to late 2000s. James remained ever the force, while Bosh still contributed in his third-man role. 54 wins again earned them second seed, this time behind Indy, who'd been looking to dethrone Miami for a 3rd straight year. Little did they know, the medical team's restoration plan had somewhat worked. Each round of the playoffs, Wade improved ever so slightly, peaking in the conference finals where both he and Bosh provided adequate support to get the job done in 6. Peaking in the conference finals proved to be exactly the problem. In a rematch against San Antonio, his body simply betrayed him, falling to 15 points on 43% role player production. Worse off was his defense, which had dwindled to non-existent against a Spurs team capable of exploiting any type of mistake. At the same time, Bosh hadn't fared much better, but gone were the days where anyone had even expected him to. While LeBron's raw stats tell the story of a lone wolf, he too struggled to produce when the games actually mattered or could be realistically affected. Yet this probably wouldn't have been the case if Popovich had to make defensive adjustments accounting for his co-stars. In a decisive 5 games, the Super Friends had suffered another finals loss, bringing the total to 500 and eliminating the veil of invincibility at the worst possible time. To continue winning championships, Riley would need to steer this era into its second phase. Gone were the days of his max players overwhelming the opposition. Wade could likely be a star-level role player going forward, with Bosh likely needing to replace him as second option. And then the team would need to be mostly built to suit LeBron's needs. It was certainly hard to ignore his lack of commitment though. James never agreed to be a Heat lifer, sign in the summer, nothing concrete. After being trapped in Cleveland, any front office would need to earn his signature. Though, you could argue Miami had. 4 finals in 4 years, solid support signings, an Eastern Conference with little in the way of actual challengers. Why would he ever leave? Where exactly were the greener pastures? Riley had clearly been spooked though. Addressing matters in mid-June, here's what he had to say.
I think everybody needs to get a grip. Media, Heat, players, organization, all of our fans. You got to get a grip. This stuff is hard. And you got to stay together if you got the guts and you don't find the first door and run out of it if you have an opportunity. I didn't come down here 19 years ago for a quick trip to South Beach and get a suntan. I can guarantee you that. And I don't think they did either. And so I think all of those guys, that have come here have gotten exactly what they wanted. They got the best competition, on the biggest stage. And we won 2 of them. They have the right to pursue those options and think about those options. And, whether they stay the way they are or whether they opt out, then we'll know what we have to do. But I don't take anything away from what LeBron had to say. He has to get away and he has to think about it.
I remember hearing the speech thinking, trouble in paradise? Absolutely. He could put these pieces in the media challenging his guys to reinvent themselves, stay the course, and author another chapter in history. Only he couldn't control LeBron as LeBron couldn't control him. Or Wade's knees. Cleveland had always been calling him to finish the job, and as Wade would tell it later, 4 years of relative success had just made everything a bit stale. Basketball wasn't as fun, their jokes didn't land with each other the same. It had been nice to see them play out the vision from the Yes We Did party. A traumatized LeBron simply needed proof he wasn't signing up for another carry job. Despite everything he's probably said about his second decision, one thing has become clear. The man doesn't stick around to see ships sink anymore if he doesn't have to. On July 11th, around 2 weeks after Riley's spirited soliloquy, the big 3 were no more. James took the first bus back home, leaving Bosh and Wade to fend for themselves. Hell, it almost just left Wade. His power forward had been fielding serious offers from Houston where, at the time, it seemed if LeBron left, so would he. And yet another what if recently spawning within the media. At some point during the trio's tenure, Chris Paul was almost traded to Miami, only falling apart because CP3 didn't want to give up number 3. I can't imagine what year it was, given how Wade offered he was in his prime though. My guess would be after the 2011 loss, where Paul was looking for a new home outside of New Orleans, and before he'd been traded to the Clippers. Really, it could not have been any other year, all things considered. Also, it couldn't have been anyone else than Bosh being traded. Crazy to imagine how our timeline potentially flips on its head here. While Wade steadily declines, Paul and LeBron continue to hold the fort well into the late 2010s. I doubt James leaves having another friend on the team to keep matters fresh and competitive. In our reality, the era had come to a swift end. Arguably a disappointing one even, as when they initially joined, I don't think any less than 3 championships had been expected. Now knowing the excruciating pain he was in, I believe Wade could have called it quits right there. He'd been the catalyst behind the franchise's only 3 titles, assured they would stay on the map after the 90s, while also becoming one of the greatest players in NBA history in only 11 seasons. He could go home now if he so chose. He just wasn't built like that. As mentioned earlier, any halfway decent team could gain footing in the mid-2010s East. They'd just have to see LeBron about it in the postseason. Having retained Bosh, Pat went out piecing together what he could around his remaining stars. If Wade could find a resurgence while Bosh returned to his Toronto mindset, there's no way they couldn't at least contend for the conference finals, seeing as Georgia's Pacers were removed from the equation. And so, a very weird season of Miami Heat basketball ensued, possibly the weirdest. Wade appeared in 62 games, playing all-star basketball, while Bosh also qualified, posting his highest point per game average since arriving. It wasn't all roses though. Through the first 52 games, both of them missed a combined 24 matches, leading to a 22-30 record by All-Star break and clearly not contending. Now for the strange part. Remember, the East sucked, so the lowly record still gave them a shot at making the playoffs, and when healthy would obviously likely be better than your typical 8th seed. Ensuring such, Riley would swing a trade for All-NBA point guard Goran Dragic, who'd won Most Improved in 2014. Compounding the excitement was a random 1 in a million run by G League center Hassan Whiteside starting in January, where he averaged 13 points, 4 blocks, and 12 rebounds over the span of a month. With Dragic joining the fray on February 19th over All-Star break, the hampered unit saw reason for optimism. A lineup of him, Wade, Ding, Bosh, and Whiteside was at worst the 3rd or 4th best Eastern team depending on what you thought of Atlanta. This was a core led by 2 stars who'd been there, which was more than anyone outside of Cleveland could say. As Wade told it at the dawn of the season, LeBron knew they were coming for him. On February 21st, 2015, Chris Bosh was ruled out of the remainder of the season with blood clots. What? 48 hours after Riley had snuck in another masterful maneuver, all hopes of any runs vanished into thin air. The second big man in franchise history to sustain a serious, unexpected health condition totally altering their path for the future. His re-signing had been the only reason Miami hadn't had to completely restart. With the deflating news, they'd missed the postseason, entering the lottery for the first time since 2008. With the 10th pick in the 2015 draft, Riley chose Justice Winslow, who you can find on the cover of a magazine with Dwyane Wade, part of an edition covering the passing of torches. Ha! This wasn't quite necessary yet anyways. By all measures, the 2015 squad was about to go on a post-All-Star break run. The young guy was a nice addition, but it was unfinished business for a team who'd had their dreams snatched away. Almost exactly a year after Bosh's initial diagnosis, the team would have their dreams snatched away. The 29 and 24 Heat would learn their all-star now had a blood clot in his leg, as recurrence was always a possibility. He wouldn't immediately be barred from playing. It took until around May to announce he was gone for good. While extremely unlikely the 2016 Heat could have beaten the eventual champion Cavaliers anyways, they played close games with the Pistons and lost 2 to Toronto, so who knows. In any case, it was all made more painful by the fact Wade continued proving he had more left in the tank. Against Charlotte, he remained the team's top scorer and gave us an absolute classic against Purple Shirt Guy, who's probably responsible for the Hornets being unable to close it out there. Against the 56-win Raptors, he put up one of his best playoff performances in years, averaging 24 points and 6 rebounds, pushing them 7. With Dragic by his side posting 19 points a game and Whiteside being nearly good for a double-double. All this to say, I'm fairly certain with Bosh available, Miami easily gets to the conference finals in what would have been LeBron and Wade's first playoff matchup ever. Instead, the Heat were dismissed, now with 2 Boshless runs under their belt since 2014. In September 2016, he failed the physical exam, blocking his path to participating in training camp. Shortly afterward, Riley declared his run in Miami was likely over, but that nobody would ever wear number 1 for them again. At least in Miami, it was time for his tenure to end anyways because, Wade's had? Given circumstances and where everything had gone, the franchise he'd done so much for was only offering 2 years $20 million, compared to the 2 years $47 million Chicago put forward. Remember, this isn't so far removed from LA sacrificing their future to give Kobe Bryant what amounted to a thank you contract. Pat had no such intentions, however. They'd maxed out Chris Bosh a couple of years ago. This summer they maxed Whiteside, who looked to be a pillar of the future, and they needed flexibility to pursue Kevin Durant, or whatever else they could in free agency to remain competitive. All in all, Wade himself felt he'd already sacrificed so much, taking a swift pay cut not only to enable the Big Three in the first place, but also ensure Udonis Haslem could stay and enjoy the success with him. He gave so much, and in his eyes, the front office was giving back so little now that he could no longer benefit their future. Thus, the man who'd once had a county renamed after him bolted for his original home, leaving the NBA world and Riley himself floored. No Wade, no Bosh, no James. It was only 2016, a year once upon a time thought to be the hypothetical end of the trio. This go around, there'd be no all-time draft to immediately pull them from despair. Plus, despair doesn't really accurately describe it. The 2017 Miami Heat broke even at 500, actually tying with Wade's Bulls for 8th seed, though not qualifying for postseason action. They did, however, qualify for a top 15 pick in the draft, selecting center Bam Adebayo at 14. As the story goes, during pre-draft workouts, Miami brass put Bam in defensive switching drills over and over again, seeing if he was proficient, testing if he could guard ball at the top. After what he considered to be an excessive amount of requests, Bam recounts he cursed out Pat Riley, Spoelstra, Alonzo Mourning, and whoever else was present, saying something along the lines of, quote, "You got me fucked up. I'm getting all these stops and there's nothing more you need to see at this point. Y'all got me fucked up out here thinking I'm just gonna crack." It was a match made in heaven. He was young, so his impact on the season would be somewhat minimal. However, Pat Riley once again was able to do right by bringing D-Wade home, who'd now also seen a random stint in Cleveland. There'd clearly been some hiccups along the way, though the one thing Pat hadn't often done was burn bridges, even keeping in contact with Caron Butler after he learned of his trade on an airport television. The bridge with Wade in particular would chart a path forward for the franchise in the 2020s. After making the playoffs and being swiftly dealt with by Philly, the 2019 Heat hadn't added much other than an undrafted rookie by the name of Duncan Robinson, a forgettable headline in the way of news that Dwyane Wade would choose to retire at season's end. Re-signing for a final season, it was the way it was always supposed to go. Not wearing another jersey, not contending on the bench of some other contender. One last ride, in full view of the franchise he partly helped build. In line with his legend, on November 25th, he scored 35 points, the most ever by a Heat bench player. He'd truly given every last ounce of himself to the city, with one more parting gift along the way. While a member of Chicago, he forged a friendship with star player Jimmy Butler, putting a good word in about Miami and its culture, explaining it'd be a perfect fit. When Wade abruptly left the first time, he had nobody to hand things off to. Winslow never panned out. There was just no general direction. This time, upon hanging it up, nobody knew it yet, but the next few years were already set. With some exciting moments along the way, Wade played his final game as a member of the Miami Heat, notching a triple-double nonetheless, ending his career on his own terms somehow. 3 championships, a finals MVP, 23,000 points, best shot-blocking shooting guard of all time, easily top 5 shooting guard of all time, all while cementing himself as the greatest, most consequential player in a franchise's history. Not bad for the man with no meniscus. On July 2nd, 2019, the Miami Heat acquired 4-time All-Star Jimmy Butler, who'd made it clear he wanted to sign a 4-year deal with the club. After stints in both Minnesota and Philly, where the players or culture simply failed to match his style and intensity, he'd likely found a home. The interesting part, if you look back, is nothing was expected of the signing from outsiders. They traded Whiteside and Josh Richardson in the deal, leaving little in the way of a competitive roster around a thought-to-be mid-tier star who was nearing 30. It was better than nothing, maybe. At pick 13 in the 2019 draft, Tyler Hero would hop on board, immediately adding a much-needed scorer to the mix. Along those lines, Kendrick Nunn, who'd been undrafted in 2018, signed on in April of this season. Through mid-season acquisition, Riley would gain access to both Jay Crowder and Andre Iguodala. Oh, and don't forget Gabe Vincent either, who'd signed a 2-way deal, blipping on the radar a bit later. Still having hung on to Dragic, who became an All-Star in 2018, the 2020 Miami Heat jumped back into the Eastern Conference's top 5, with very clear potential to anyone who'd been paying attention. True, they initially hadn't qualified as more than a dark horse, yet one only had to watch them defend Milwaukee during the regular season to figure out they could certainly take the best team in the conference just off of matchup features alone. Plus, both Butler and Adebayo had made All-Stars, so they weren't flying too far under anyone's radar. If they could beat the Bucks, they could truthfully beat any East team. This much held true once in the bubble, they just about dominated Milwaukee, then went on to once again defeat Boston on the way to the NBA Finals. For reference, here was a team who literally just retired its longtime star on a non-playoff roster, immediately turning around to scale the conference. It took one star free agent signing, some wise drafting, and great coaching from a man Riley handpicked many years ago. Too bad they were taking it all up against LeBron James and a Lakers team who'd been well on its way to winning before the season stoppage. A predictable loss may have struck the franchise, not before Jimmy Butler kicked off his Heat career with an improbable finals performance, all after being labeled one of the worst free agent signings of 2019. He led a team who seemed to now be one move away. The Godfather didn't earn the nickname for nothing. Sure, his looks added to it, however, over the span of this video, you've seen again and again the decision making was A1 top to bottom. That didn't stop his reputation from taking somewhat of a hit in the 2020s, where to fans, it appears no move has been big enough since coming within 2 wins of another title. The 2021 Heat mostly ran it back, featuring year 2 of Tyler Hero and Kendrick Nunn, who'd miraculously finished second in Rookie of the Year voting. Max Strus was discovered in Chicago's leftovers, later acquiring Victor Oladipo post-injury. The thought there being he still had some juice as part of a contending team, a low-risk, high-reward move which went the other direction once he tore his quad in April 2021. Of all the randomness the post-bubble season saw across the league, Miami was hit rather hard, never being able to drum up too much momentum, resulting in a sweep against an improved, hungry Milwaukee Bucks. To onlookers and doubters, it only confirmed the belief of summer 2019 that it was never a great roster to begin with, and would eventually need a bigger splash to justify the Jimmy signing. With the makeup of the league, nearby off-seasons would offer multiple prizes, one of which was sure to end up in South Beach, as usually happened through Riley's tenure. The franchise was clearly top-notch, the culture was proving to force the best out of players you'd otherwise probably never hear about, and it was Miami. Sooner or later, the move was coming. Before 2022 kicked off, Duncan Robinson was signed to a $90 million deal. Okay, I mean, he'd certainly proved his worth as a shooter, and the Heat didn't have the luxury of letting any of its contributors walk. But $90 million? Along with acquiring recent NBA champions Kyle Lowry and PJ Tucker, while grifting a lightly used Caleb Martin from Charlotte, Pat was proving to be working behind the scenes even if Butler didn't necessarily have his true co-star yet. In February, he'd also discover Haywood Highsmith for later purposes. Miami finished first in a highly competitive East, despite not housing the raw talent of other contenders. Part of their success attributed to Bam Adebayo continuing to grow as a defensive juggernaut, causing headaches for many opposing bigs and being able to, switch. The way the Heat brass had humorously tested him years ago. As the playoffs got underway, Atlanta was quick work, falling perfectly into Miami's style of defense. Philly never got a healthy shot at him, and it set yet another playoff match with the Boston Celtics, who were in the midst of a legendary in-season turnaround. Through a brutally ugly 7-game series, the Heat would come within one shot of their second NBA Finals in 3 years. Maybe they'd fallen short in heartbreak for now. They'd gotten this close still. Proof of concept was no issue. They only needed a slight jolt to go further. The jolt would not come in the form of any expected deals during summer 2022. As Durant requested a trade, Miami chose not to seriously pursue him, seeing as how they had no plans to part ways with either of their stars, leaving only Tyler Hero and other pieces available. To Miami, gutting depth for Durant wouldn't change their situation, so no deal. Donovan Mitchell served as a backup plan to KD, which they never got to move on because A, their package wasn't enough, and B, they continued to pause and see what Brooklyn would do with their star. Durant ultimately wouldn't be moved until later in 2023, with Mitchell going to the highest bidder in Cleveland. Emerging from summer 0-2, they ran it back once again, promoting returning players to higher roles. Due to crucial pieces being in and out of the lineup, combined with Jimmy Butler's general lack of seriousness in the regular season, they'd have to play their way into an 8th seed, nearly getting eliminated overall, where fans assumed they'd finally land an upcoming star this time. Only after eking into postseason play, they'd begin tangling with the Milwaukee Bucks again, soon bearing witness to Giannis taking a nasty spill. All of a sudden, what we thought would be a quick and painless series cracked the door open for an experienced team all too eager to capitalize on any given weaknesses. Before you knew it, Butler was doing the thing again, absolutely blitzing the Bucks into a 3-1 deficit. After an unbelievable Game 6, the matter had been settled. A Tyler Hero-less, 8th-seeded Miami Heat team had caught fire at the right moment, disposing of the 1 seed. Butler would hurt his ankle at the onset of another New York battle, predictably doing little in the way of actually affecting the outcome. 8th seed and 6. The Eastern Conference Finals was put on repeat, this time featuring Boston as defending conference champs. Talent-wise, especially given health, 2022 should have also been put on repeat. Though, the men in green took it upon themselves to slip into an 0-3 pitfall after activating Jimmy Butler at the worst time possible. Also, Duncan Robinson, whose massive contract had been looking like a massive waste of money most of the year, started adding another dimension outside of shooting, making life much more miserable. Their longtime rivals refused to lay down. A furious run brought them back, pushing Miami to the very brink of becoming history's first team to blow a 3-0 series lead in professional sports. Fortunately, Riley's cast of randoms through the years around Jimmy and Bam had been enough to get it done. For the second time in 4 seasons, the Heat were headed to the NBA Finals, immediately shining light on the glaring problem this Jimmy team has had since its inception. There wasn't a soul outside of Miami, maybe even in the city itself, who believed they were a match for the Denver Nuggets. Much like their trip to the 20 finals against LA, the limitations to their capabilities were well understood. It took so much grit and exceptional performance to arrive, it simply takes more than that to win a championship series. And so, after being gentlemen swept by the superior unit, another round of superstar roulette went down, now featuring Bradley Beal and Damian Lillard. Missing out on Beal, while disappointing, hadn't hurt so much. He's been routinely injured in his career, didn't provide a whole lot outside of scoring. Meanwhile, his contract would require giving up a ton for a maybe type guy. Then there was Dame, who'd been pretty clear about his intentions to take his talents to South Beach. He'd be the perfect star next to Jimmy and Bam regardless of the cost, spreading the floor to the half-court mark, adding more rim pressure. Overall, just granting Miami the extra punch they've been missing to truly be taken seriously outside of the East. Today, we have the information from Lillard himself. Joe Cronin wasn't interested in working with Miami on a deal. Allegedly unimpressed by their offer, Dame's agent tried dissuading other teams who might have wanted to trade for him, even prompting a warning from the league. Still, radio silence between Portland and Miami, making it clear the dream, which had existed for maybe a year or two now, was dead. To add insult to missing on Durant, Mitchell, Beal, and Lillard, their rival Bucks swooped in and stole him, which was a known potential consequence of failing to pull this off. Not necessarily to imply anyone knew Milwaukee would do it, but just as it was known in the Shaq sweepstakes close to 20 years ago, somebody would benefit, directly working against the Heat's interest. This brings us to present day, where their current predicament looks almost identical to years past. Their regular season is mid. Jimmy Butler isn't making a ton of noise as he doesn't totally care for accolades that aren't a title. Riley has made a couple of smaller moves which may pay off in May. Speaking of which, the rest of the roster has convinced fans a run is on the table regardless of where they finish. Their work in the draft granted them another rookie who had no business going straight to a defending conference champion. The East features multiple rosters who look better and play better, with no actual guarantee of what'll happen should they meet within the boundaries of a 7-game series. Pat Riley has so far been unable to put the finishing touches on a team who will soon run out of time with Butler approaching his mid-30s, very clearly affected by the miss on Lillard. If the help never arrives, well, let's just say like San Antonio, Miami has already experienced more success in a short time than many other franchises will ever dream of. As you now see though, it wasn't by chance. The mastermind made a long series of calculated decisions to lead them over nearly 30 years. The culture remained strong and the players even stronger. He brought with him 3 titles, some of history's most exciting names, and relevance to an expansion franchise, as their counterparts in Charlotte have never even had enough success to claim they have a rival. Only time will tell where it all goes from here, as Miami seems unlikely to finish the job in 2024. Just watch out for Riley. He may have been memed over recent years for his inactivity, yet you can't deny he's consistently been on top of it all since the Jordan days. Also, even if this current group never finishes the job, what they've been able to accomplish and the talent finds have been ultra impressive since they signed Jimmy Butler. And looking at the franchise, that tracks. The Miami Heat, one of the most successful franchises in NBA history.